Okay. Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome this morning to our webinar in relation to neglect. We're going to start when the clock gets to 10:03, just to allow one or two more colleagues to join us. Just as everybody's joining this morning, if I can just remind you that we would encourage anybody that's got a question to use the question and answer facility on live. I think if you hover your mouse above the icon that looks like two little speech bubbles, I think that's the one you've got. If you want to type any questions in, and then Tracy can pick those up and prompt me with any questions for Susannah. So it's just turned 10:03 and we're now going to start. I'm just going to say some words of introduction, but first of all, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Susannah Bowyer, who is Assistant Director from Research and Practice. We're absolutely delighted that she's with us this morning. She's going to make a presentation in a few moments' time in relation to the recent research and thinking in relation to neglect. But before we do that, I'll introduce myself. I'm Walter McCulloch. I'm Assistant Director for Children's Social Care and Youth Justice at Suffolk County Council. And I'm delighted this morning to have the opportunity of hosting this morning. This is an especially important and relevant webinar for Suffolk, particularly in relation to the Suffolk Safeguarding Partnership having hosted a seminar in person, really, at the beginning of 2019, focusing on neglect, which launched our neglect strategy and really redoubled our effort about our work in relation to neglect. It's an issue that's showing particular prevalence across many families in Suffolk. And children who are on child protection plans in Suffolk, in the majority, are on plans because of reason of neglect, although that clearly is contributed to by a number of features in their lives. I think the final thing for me to say before asking Susannah to start really is that whilst neglect in general terms can cover a whole range of ideas and concepts in our mind, we really would want to assert from the start that neglect in its own right is a form of abuse that should be considered, and the impact on the emotional, physical, health development of children, both at the stage they are at as they're experiencing the neglect, but also as they go into different life stages and transition points in their life into adolescence and into early adulthood. And so it's a really important and pertinent topic for us to be considering this morning. And with no further ado, I'm going to ask Susannah if she would kindly start with her presentation. Following presentation will be some opportunity for questions and answers, so don't forget to make any questions onto the question and answer board. So Susannah, please do start.
Great, thank you, Walter. Hi, everybody. Great to be with you from my bedroom in rainy Devon, and to be the chance now to go through quite swiftly about 15 or 16 slides and quite a lot of information, which I know is, a lot to be taken in on what is quite a big and multi-dimensional concept, this one-word heading under which so many different behaviours and experiences sit. So I just ask you to buckle in, and we'll be whipping through this material, leaving as much time for question and answers at the end. But I'll also be referring back to a whole raft of resources on the Research and Practice website, which, as members of Research and Practice, everybody with a suffolk.gov.uk email can very straightforwardly access, and people in the Safeguarding Partnership can also have licenses to access the materials arranged as well. Okay, so can we hop on to the second slide, please, Howard? Yeah, lovely. Okay, great. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the definitions and concept. It's in working together. You'll be familiar with working together. But what I think the sort of diagram on the slides expresses is what a multi-dimensional concept neglect is. And as we can see from all of those different areas where we might be observing neglectful parenting, there might be a range of explanations for why a child's needs might not be being responded to. So just as with any analysis of a situation, a child safeguarding or child protection situation, understanding the story behind the presenting situation is really vital here. So for instance, you know, in terms of medical neglect, am I not bringing my child to an appointment at the doctor's because I don't have the bus fare to get to the surgery, or because I'm not allowed out of the flat by a coercive and controlling partner, or because I have some big, deep fear of doctors myself, or perhaps because I want to conceal something, some bruising or something. So as we can see, you know, just from those 4 examples around that one particular situation, our responses to that situation would be very different depending on what that story might be. It's important also just to touch on that point that neglect can be both about omission, about not doing something, and also about commission, about somebody actively doing something, which again makes it, you know, one of the more complex areas of safeguarding and child protection to get into. The 2 images on the screen there are of 2 reports which I found very helpful in putting this material together, and they're both open access, and the references are at the end of these slides, which I'm sure we'll be sharing with you afterwards. So can we go on to the next one, Howard, please, and have a think about prevalence. So as Howard was saying, you know, neglect or emotional abuse and neglect are recorded as the primary category of need on a huge percentage of child's in need plans and child protection plans. So this is the national data from March 2019, and we see that 54% of children in need had abuse or neglect recorded as their primary category. And then figure R on the slide, the bar chart shows that children who went on to be subject of a child protection plan nationally, neglect and emotional abuse were the initial categories for 83% of plans. So it's a consistently large, and as we can see, a rising proportion of the children we're working with. And again, you know, hopping back to what we were talking about there, it's such a large umbrella for a wide range of experiences and behaviours, and may at times be a way of labelling a particularly concerning situation in order to get service responses. That, you know, this unpacking what's going on under that term is a really vital part of the safeguarding process. So I think it's very interesting for you locally and across the region to think about how the data where you are compares to those national statistics, but also in terms of social work, teamwork, but also in terms of what's going on in particular schools or what's going on in particular areas. How do you analyse together the range of issues that you're coding of neglect as neglect, and then think about your practice responses to those? The red table on the slide breaks down the data on national data on child protection plans by age, and this really kind of brings home to us that neglect is something that can feature in the lives of children right across the span of childhood and adolescence. And it's, as Walter was kind of signalling in his introduction, the impacts can be both immediate and long lasting. We'll go on to the next slide now and think a little bit more about ages and stages of children and how they respond to neglect. So if you could, yeah, lovely, thank you. Again, the images at the top of the slide are of materials, 2 research in practice. One is a Children's Society report, which help you dig a bit deeper into understanding normal child development, and therefore where children are straying from what you would expect in normative child development, understanding adolescent development and how some of early experiences might be playing out in behaviours that you'll be seeing in the way that adolescents are presenting. So there's lots of material there for digging deeper as teens. It's rarely life-threatening neglect. That sometimes occurs, but it's much more about compromising a child's development across multiple domains. And because neglect frequently coexists with other forms of maltreatment, it can be difficult to disentangle its unique consequences. But there are a couple of things that people do note through the research. One is that neglected children tend to differ from other maltreated children in that they show more evidence of delayed cognitive development, poor language skills, poor social skills and coping abilities. They may often present as dependent and unhappy. They may, have had experience since infancy of their responses to their needs being ignored or not, not properly responded to, and that may cause them to withdraw from relationships, easily feel a sense of failure and even, blame themselves for the neglect that they're experiencing. The longer that children are exposed to neglect, the greater the harm will be. There can sometimes be a sense with working with adolescents that, oh, well, he'll be used to it by now. That's been the way it's been. That really isn't the case. Cumulative harm, which I'll come to in a sec, is a very good term to think about in terms of how harm builds over time. Because the statutory definition of neglect relies on chronicity, on issues continuing over time or recurring frequently, the fact that we need to build a case in that way, or we can see things kind of bumping along and think, well, that in itself isn't a significant harm, this can often delay much needed responses. So we really need to think together about how we can respond early and swiftly to things that otherwise might just bump along the bottom in a way that can be very unhelpful. Obviously, babies and toddlers are innately more vulnerable and can suffer severe harm from neglect very quickly. School-age children, when we're not in lockdown and when they are in school, and I know we all have a lot of concerns about what we're going to find as children are coming back into school, they generally have a better chance of being noticed and recognised by adults who see them every day. Children with disabilities, whether or not they are eligible for specialist services, but children with disabilities and speech and language disabilities as well are much more likely to be maltreated than their non-disabled peers, and neglect is the most common form of maltreatment that they experience. And then older children, are present so differently from infants in that teenagers' responses to neglectful parenting may bring them into situations of risk and harm outside the family context. It's a very quick trot, obviously, through through 0 to 18 plus, and as I say, there's lots more material there on our website, but I hope that gives you a sense of how these things are going on across childhood, and how we need to be alert to that across the piece. Next one then, please, Howard. So one of the really good sources of evidence to work in multi-agency partnerships around safeguarding children broadly and around thinking about neglect specifically are the triennial and biennial analyses of serious case reviews that have been carried out over a number of years by Peter Sidebotham and Marion Brandon and their colleagues. And on that slide, there's a hyperlink to an open access website where we have worked with that team for a number of years now, publishing summary documents for education, health, police, safeguarding board, local safeguarding boards, and social care and early help. Short briefings that summarise some of the key messages from these serious case reviews, which are really helpful for multi-agency training, and I'd really encourage you to have a look at some of that. So some of the key things that came out of the most recent triennial analysis that was published earlier this year are very much aligned with earlier analyses as well. Again, this message that chronic unmet need leads to some of the worst outcomes for children. One-off incidents that trigger statutory intervention of physical or sexual abuse may be one-off or may be repeated over time, but they cause a response, a service response. This persistent failure to meet a child's needs over time can be, very damaging when we don't have that trigger incident to spark off our service activity. And this is where the joined up early help and universal services, and as much as possible where social work and social care expertise is being fed into the schools or the other universal settings to help colleagues to think about risk and think about harm and think about responding below the statutory threshold. As we can see here, the most recent report really draws out a lot of this material about what were the sort of parental risk factors or vulnerabilities in the family. So the research team dug into 208 cases in which neglect was a feature and analysed the issues and adversities that were recorded in the serious case review. And as we can see, and as you would be not surprised to see, domestic abuse and parental mental health were issues for most of these families. But what we see in these serious case reviews are these other problems and issues with issues such as transient lifestyles, multiple partners, splitting, acrimonious breakups between adult partners, and social isolation being a big issue there for a lot of these families. As well as that, thinking about that 40% of the parents were recorded as having experienced adversity in their own childhood, and that's just the ones that were recorded on the serious case review. We can see that as a very significant issue in neglect situations. Only 11% of the neglect cases had none of these family factors documented in the serious case review, while 42% had at least 3 of these different factors documented. So as you'll be more than aware, these are issues that you want to be thinking, when you're seeing an accumulation of these issues and keeping an eye on families where there's accumulation of these issues, you want to be very alert to what's going on with the children at the centre of it. Which brings us to this slide. Sorry, I was a bit out of sync with your slide there, and what you had up there, Howard, but never mind. We're back to here now, so seeing and hearing the child at the centre. So obviously, if a child's hit or sexually abused, they know that, and they can to some extent disclose that. But being neglected is something that you're not really able to know if that is the life that you've known. So that children are extremely dependent on us as the people around them to really see where they're standing out in terms of being not visible, not coming to school, not being brought to medical appointments, or where a child stands out in terms of coming to school unwashed, persistent head lice, tooth decay being a very severe tooth decay being a very interesting indicator, and working with dental surgeries in that way has proved a very fruitful interaction around safeguarding in some areas of the country. When we're logging this information, we really need to be, no serious case review ever says too much information was shared. It's frequent finding in serious case reviews that there was a lack of information sharing, but we're all drowned in information, aren't we? And it's proportionate, timely information sharing that we need to be thinking about, and we need to be getting into recording issues with clear analytical kind of chronologies, not recording every reams of narrative, but key issues, and writing in language that you would be willing to share with the people that you're describing. And I'll come back to that when we're talking about relationship-based practice in a moment. We want to move away from professional jargon, stereotyping, and the kind of ways in which we can get into cut and pasting different kind of observations from one report to another. We need to be really training ourselves to think and write and speak in ways that we would be prepared to share with the families that we're working in partnership with. Pop on to the next slide. Thanks, Howard. So these next 2 slides, I'm not suggesting that you try and read these in detail, but I'm just flagging these because it was an interesting conversation on Twitter between social work practitioners around how to listen and talk and hear with children themselves. And on the first one, this slide we're looking at here, this 10-year-old saying, people just always ask me the same questions over and over again. And in situations of neglect where the family may be bouncing in and out of service, initial assessment activity or early help assessment activity, this may very well be a feature, and we need to think a little bit outside the box here, and the one that they're talking about here is the 3 houses, the signs of safety 3 houses, which kind of swept through the nation like a tsunami over a few years, didn't it? The use of signs of safety, which has a lot going for it. They're strength-based tools, very interesting tools, tools that are drawn out of social work expertise. But of course, if we get into a pattern of rote of using the same forms, the same approaches time and time again with children, we will be deadened in our responses, in our thinking and hearing and listening. And if they are being faced with the same questions and the same surveys time and time again, they will be deadened in their responses as well. So when you share these slides, have a look at the Twitter conversation. If you could just go on to the next one as well there, Howard. You know, there's some really nice, cheap or free, simple ideas about, you know, how to do things a little bit differently, using a Jenga game with questions pasted to the Jenga pieces, doing a genogram using little toys, or buttons, which somebody is talking about in this Twitter thread here. I'm sure between you have lots and lots of really dynamic, active ideas about this kind of thing. And so just as social media is a great way to share these kind of ideas nationally, you know, how are you able to share between teams and across teams and different professional groups, how to engage actively and well with the children and families that you're working with? So I'll just leave that with you as something to have a look at and something to really pick up on and think, you know, keeping ourselves alert to, you know, what it is that we're trying to do, rather than just going out and thinking, you know, I have to fill in this form, I have to get this form done, because a lot of that is going on around the country and we're missing a lot of tricks by just kind of getting into by rote patterns. Okay, on to the next one then, thanks, which is around parent and child relationships. So with, you know, just at this point, just let's have a little pause and maybe just, you know, just shake it out a bit, just clap your hands a bit. You know, I'm bombing through a lot of material here, so, you know, just stay with me. Okay, here we're going to talk about parent-child relationships, noticing relationships, because this is absolutely at the core of the whole thing. Dania Glazer, who's a very experienced professor who's worked in this field for a long, long time, and she co-authored the research and practice briefing that's in the corner there. She argues that emotional abuse and neglect, the key thing is you're describing a relationship between the parent and the child, rather than the event or series of events occurring within the parent and child relationship, and that the interactions of concern pervade the relationship. So here she's pointing us to be alert to the more subtle failure to display attentiveness and responsiveness. That lack of responsiveness may well reflect a parent's own mental models and their own experience of parenting, you know, being parented, their own experience of relationships, their own experience of maltreatment in childhood, quite possibly. And in those kind of situations, their own children's expressions of stress or anxiety or need can provoke powerful feelings for a parent related to their own unmet need in the past. So there's a lot that is going on there that we need to be able to take the time to see and observe and recognise. Those indicators of breakdown or lack of relationship are going to look very different at different stages of a child's lifetime. With infants, we might see mothers not in tune with baby's needs, not engaging with the baby, not responding to its cues. They may be using expressions like, this baby is winding me up, as though the baby has some sort of motivation to frustrate or, you know, irritate the mother in a way that needs unpacking. You might find parents very withdrawn, either very withdrawn and not interested, or very critical, overcritical and finding fault. Not picking up on a child's cues for help, rarely talking or interacting with them. With older children, this might be manifested in parents kicking a child out to fend for themselves, despite the risks that might expose them to. And children's expression of these experiences takes many forms as well. Developmental delay in the early years, anger and frustration about finding carers unavailable to meet their needs, learning delay, difficulties with friendships. And what's key here is that the difference between a family living in poverty and being unable to meet some of their children's needs because of those contextual factors of poverty, poor housing, but who have a strong parent-child relationship, the difference between those and the ones where the relationship has broken down in the ways that I'm describing there is an extremely important clue in deciding what it is that we're going to do to try and help. Just looking at that quote and seeing if there's anything more we want to say about that, but that I think is a quote from the Serious Case Reviews, and it just really describes, you know, that kind of situation where a child, a very young grandmother with serious money problems took on the care of her grandchild. There were these clues in this conversation that she had with the fostering support officer that she found it hard to like Megan, and there wasn't any follow-up to that, and there were very serious consequences that followed for the child safeguarding. Okay, on to the next one then. Thank you. So obviously, you know, the interaction between family poverty and concerns about neglect is quite a complex one. It's important to say that poverty is neither a necessary nor a sufficient factor, but it is probably the most pervasive factor when we're thinking about child neglect. There is this strong association between family poverty and a child's chance of suffering abuse and neglect, and the greater the economic hardship, the greater the likelihood and severity of child abuse. So, you know, obviously in the situation that we're in now, economically as a country, you know, these, again, I don't need to tell you, are hugely pressing concerns. So poverty can be both a direct or indirect causal factor. So direct effects are obviously that you can't afford food, you can't afford blankets, you know, heating, those kind of things. Indirect effects, you know, are, you know, the experience of poverty and what it's like to live in poverty, you know, the social isolation, the shame and stigma that people feel about experiencing poverty in our society today, and the way in which a lot of that is individuated into a sort of that, you know, that's your fault rather than, you know, that thinking about the structural issues that are contributing to somebody's socioeconomic situation. Low levels of education, low levels of literacy, the social environment, the physical environment in which people are living. These are all indirect causes of parental stress that make it then much more difficult to parent. And these interactions are frequently complex and frequently circular. So poverty increases the risk of mental ill health, and of course mental ill health increases the likelihood of poverty. So these are not straightforward causal relationships, but they are relationships that we need to pay more attention to than we have been really in social work and family support practice explicitly, probably for some decades. Can we have the next one, please? So there was some very interesting work done over the last couple of years where they use this term that poverty has become the wallpaper of practice, that we're not really seeing it or thinking about it explicitly because it is the commonality that we're seeing in so many of the families that we're working with. But we need to really bring it out from the wallpaper of practice and reflect on its impact on families' abilities to meet children's needs, including these things about discrimination, the intersectionality of poverty with Black and minority ethnic identity, for instance, where, you know, child poverty is hugely more prevalent among Black population than it is among our white population, and these experiences of shame and stigma that we need to be really sensitive to in coming into the lives of children and families. And the second quote on that slide, you know, really underlines that in the work that we do and the way that we approach families, we can either confront or reinforce those feelings of stigma through the language we use, through the ways of working that we use. And the Twitter quote there is, you know, in case we kind of feel that these things are, you know, in the past and that we've moved on from these things, we really haven't, in terms of, you know, in many cases, in many places, the tendency to stereotype, to lack of empathy about, you know, the way in which people are living is not uncommon, sadly, in you know, the analysis of practice that goes on. And people generally are in this work because they care deeply. And it's being able to manage to bring forward that empathy and work in partnership with people that is so absolutely key. Next one, please.
2 more minutes, Susannah.
Righto, right, we're trotting on then. 2 more minutes, people, so hang in there. So this slide just helps us reflect on the ways we might be reinforcing feelings of powerlessness and stigma. You know, do we unthinkingly make demands on people that create financial pressures? Do we say, you know, you need to be at this contact centre X times a week without considering whether people are on shift work, whether people have money for the bus fare, or other issues like that? Do we use that term, which we so often see on case files, of failure to engage, without considering underlying factors? What do we mean when we're marking people down as failing to engage? And might we be advocating more and standing up for people's rights? Might we be challenging landlords about their duty to make repairs to mouldy and damp bedrooms? Might we be accompanying people to a benefits appeal hearing? Might we negotiate better debt arrangements or terms with a loan company? There was a great example in the Northeast of a benefits advisor in food, being situated in the food bank, and some millions of benefits that were the rights of the people who were coming to the food bank being retrieved and accessed by the families with the support of this benefits advisor. You know, really significant kind of practical advocacy and support that we can think about. Next one, please. So this is a nice quote, I think, from somebody who's experienced social work intervention in their lives. Social workers are perhaps the most intimate relationships we have with the state, and it's someone who has a lot of power over us. If that person is not treating us with recognition and respect, what's it doing to our self-esteem, our sense of ourselves? Whereas if actually you've got at least one person in authority that you feel's on your side, that can actually be a turning point. So, you know, there's some real hope in there. There's a real potential for the work that we're all doing together with the families that live in our communities. Next slide, please. I'm going to take a couple of extra minutes, Walter, if that's all right, just to go through these last couple of slides around relationship-based practice, which is, you know, absolutely critical. And it's a term we hear a lot, but I've been working with research and practice for about 16 years. If there's one key message about safeguarding and child protection, it's about that relationships are where change can take place. So building that relationship of trust is where change actually happens. Building trust has strong practical implications. Parents in research describe becoming more attentive and responsive to what a worker is saying once trust is built. People need to feel that workers understand what they're experiencing and that they care, not that they are being, you know, dismissed as par for the course for that part of town, or we've known that family for ages, and all of that. You know, that sense of respect, that genuine sense of respect. It's a tricky balance for workers, you know, balancing empathy with objective distance. And people, again, who've experienced social care interaction talk about this straight talking with warmth. People don't want to be, you know, bullshitted, to use a phrase. You know, people appreciate straight talking with warmth. So it's a hard balance for workers to a tightrope to walk. You know, building that relationship, but being really clear about what your concerns are. But again, this quote from the serious case reviews: where good practice in neglect cases was noted, the quality of relationships was apparent as the primary vehicle for supportive and protective practice, particularly when it's rooted in a sound grasp of the family context and roles and relationships. Really, probably the key message from all of this trot through this material. So last couple of slides then, things that we can learn from research about working with a family. So as we said, it's important to distinguish between inadequate parenting as a result of lack of parenting skills or the breakdown of that relationship versus inadequate parenting because of social, environmental or parental risk factors. So all of those things around poverty, homelessness and drug and alcohol use. It's important to be able to understand the difference between those issues and how we're going to respond to those issues differently. Creating a sense of safety for the child has to be an early goal. And then the parent-child observation to understand what's going on in that relationship. You want your work to be culturally sensitive and understand and ask questions and be open about different kinds of family relationships that are culturally normal for different families living within our communities, but guard against setting different standards around safeguarding for children from different ethnicities. One interesting thing out of the research is that addressing practical problems first is very often a very good way to get into that relationship, because parents can see that people can see what is really making their life very difficult. You know, they've no washing machine, for instance, and you know, responding to something like that can be a very good basis for getting into the more deeper entrenched difficulties. And it's been a real noticed thing around the country in lockdown that people have really responded very positively to children's social care phoning, coming and visiting their door, much more positively than they might otherwise have done, because that sense of, in lockdown, the local authority was reaching out and caring about where they were and making sure that they had food, electricity, credit. That's a real opportunity we've got there that we shouldn't squander, you know, where people have kind of opened to the fact that we're there because we care and we want to support them. There's a real opportunity there that we need to think about how we can maximise on that. Next slide, please. This is the one before last. So what's sort of pointed to there is, you know, sending people where there's a lot of complex entrenched issues on a standard universal parenting programme is very unlikely to be successful. Often these people have, as we've said, poor social skills, are socially isolated, have difficulty with relationships, and may be very stressed, may have mental health problems. They're not going to get a lot out of mainstream behavioural parenting programmes. Instead, we need to think about initially what support networks there might be and assist with developing new ones. Family group conferencing as a part of early help work. I'd be interested to know how much that happens in Suffolk. In Leeds, that has become an absolutely entrenched part of the early help offer that family group conference is provided, and that is a hugely beneficial way of thinking about and building social supports around a family. Final slide then from me. Features of successful family responses from the research. Setting clear achievable goals with regular review, setting those goals in tandem with the family, and the research and practice material on capacity to change has a really nice goal attainment scaling approach in it that's well worth having a look at. And this last one, which is very hard message in terms of resources and funding, but a very, very core message. Sustained change needs long-term, not episodic support. And this is from international research. They're talking about long-term, regular, connection with a family because of the ongoing, fluctuating, and at times cyclical interplay of vulnerability and risk. These aren't issues that are going to be addressed in one go. Very unlikely, you know, that they're going to be addressed in one go and we can dust it off. And bouncing on and off the threshold of statutory intervention is also not going to be helpful. We need to find ways that we can be working alongside people for a considerable amount of time. So if we just go to the final one more, but which has a set of questions on which we might want to leave up those questions as we go into a Q&A session. But I'm a little bit over time, but much less over time than I might otherwise be if I hadn't been going at speed. So I hope that all made sense to you, and I hope that you might have some questions and comments that we can get into now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Susannah. That's been really, really helpful. And so we have got one or two questions coming through. Just encourage others in the audience not to be bashful and come forward and ask some questions. But I'll start off with a couple to kick us off. So somebody's asking about strategies in working with families who are avoidant or difficult to engage. Now, one of the points that you've made really strongly, and in my view really importantly, has been about the importance of relationship building and the importance of relationships in general, because you made some really important points about relationship building, the use of imagination and a genuine care about the family's situation. But also you made a really important point, I think, about the worker seeing the relationships that are at play in the household as well, and really looking at that. So could you give us some thoughts in relation to working with families who are reluctant to engage, maybe avoiding engaging, and just the centrality of that message about relationships, please, Susannah.
Yeah, it can take time and persistence, and it is hard work. You've probably heard of PAWS, the service that works with parents who've had children removed from their from care in family court proceedings, and there are a lot of other services around, small scale services around the country that do that. They have the luxury of having these key workers, and to get to even through the door of those women who have had their children removed takes at times weeks and weeks and weeks of going back and knocking and all the rest of it. Why would that be? Well, if you have had your child removed by the state, you're not going to be very but very open in the first instance to the idea that somebody wants to come and build a relationship with you. So we have to think a little bit about some of those issues, about whether that family has had a long-term relationship with us as services, and what that's been like for them. And we have to, have a bit of humility and recognise that over time, social care intervention in families can be very punitive and shaming and unpleasant. So often there's some groundwork to be made up in terms of the way that we as agents of the state have been involved with families. So again, what I was saying there about practical support coming first can often be a really good groundwork for building a relationship, as can, once you can get into a conversation with somebody, finding some shared common ground with somebody. That's another thing that comes out through the research findings. Finding a shared common ground around parenting experience, for instance, can be a little window, a little sort of step upon which to start to build a personal relationship. A lot of it is about doing what you say you're going to do, turning up on time, being there when you say you're going to be there, doing the things that you say you're going to do. And, when people are carrying very full caseloads and all of that, I totally recognise the pressures and challenges on you as practitioners to be able to build these relationships. But, there's a lot about stepping into that person's shoes and thinking, well, what is this about? Is this about that there were social workers in and out of the house when you were a child, and how did they treat your, what was their relationship like with your mother? There may very well be a lot of groundwork to unpack. There may also, of course, be the fact that people are trying to hide something, but it isn't necessarily that. We need to keep our eyes open to that possibility, but we need to keep our eyes open to the fact that to the possibility that that's not the case either. They might be terrified to let you through the door.
Thanks very much. Actually, you immediately made me think there about an extraordinary practitioner that I work with, who in her determination and desire to make a genuine and authentic relationship with a mother who was in real difficulty and real poverty, and had gone round to the family home, and it had been after one of the recent gales and unseasonably windy weather, and the family's fence had blown down, and actually the practitioner with mum spent the day rebuilding the fence. Not quite the day and not quite all of the fence, but the point being that actually stepped into mum's shoes and stepped alongside mum, and the difference that made was quite considerable. But just moving on a little bit, because just building on this conversation, really interested in the point you make about the long-term nature of work, and our colleague has asked a specific question about that, and I'm going to ask it as it's written for me, which is, so coming from a practitioner, how do we work longer with families when managers are encouraging workers to close cases quickly?
Yep, and these are system issues. These are issues that middle leaders and senior leaders need to be working alongside the front line to be thinking through. So there are different approaches to that around the country that are tried and work in different ways. So really maximising on the relationship between family support and statutory services is one aspect of that, so that you have a good, strong, well supported family support response that has access to social work and social care expertise around risk and harm, but also is equipped and able to do some of this longer term work. And it's also a fact that some of those relationships are less difficult to build with family support workers who don't wield the kind of statutory authority that social workers do. There's a whole lot of work going on at the moment around having social workers in schools and building that sort of safeguarding and support response through the school setting. The What Works Centre for Children's Social Care has just announced, I think, 21 more sort of funded research sites around the country where this social workers in school approach will be trialled. But I think if you can get through some of the stages that we talked about in the presentation and think about, are these contextual issues? Is this a parent-child observation relationship issue that we need to be working with directly and addressing? If we can kind of narrow down the focus of what needs our attention, we might be in a better place to kind of make the case to managers that this is something that needs to stay within a children's social care response, whereas some of those issues might be better responded to in a family support situation by the kind of thing that Walter's talking about there, at least initially, getting in there and practically helping with some of the issues that family are facing. But ultimately, it's about the way that very, very scarce resources are allocated by senior management in these just intensely challenging conditions. We do see these kind of beacons of light or chinks of light around things like the early use of family group conferencing, not just using family group conferencing when we're coming into pre-proceedings and we're thinking about who might be alternative carers within the family network, using it much earlier down the piece to build social supports, undermine social isolation that people are feeling, and start to sort of build a kind of network of support that isn't just a professional network of support around a family.
Susannah, thank you. It's really helpful. From my part as Assistant Director for Children's Social Care and Youth Justice, I'd want to say to all of my colleagues in the audience that I'm absolutely up for thinking about how we work on a long-term basis with families, because I think that is a fundamental feature of change and ensuring that where possible, we help families restore functioning or learn and improve functioning. That is a fundamental feature of our work. So in a similar vein, a colleague has asked, and this is about how frontline staff can feel motivated to work with families where neglect is a significant feature, maybe many families on their individual workload, and how they can feel motivated about that, how they can gain confidence, how they can be more insightful. And you touched on this in a number of very important ways in relation to how colleagues could approach the tools that they might be able to see and learn from other colleagues with approaches used. But what would you say about that?
I think it's interesting, but one of the most impactful things that we see back in the day when we did do live conferences or is hearing people's stories directly from their own mouths, and in a way that's kind of counterintuitive, because you think, well, you as professionals are working direct with people all the time, so why is that so impactful to hear that at a conference? But it really is. And one of the brilliant things about social media is that there are a lot more of those voices of people who've experienced having a child removed from their care or social work involvement in their lives as a child, who are now an adult speaking out, that kind of thing. So really accessing some of that at a national level, I think, can be very, very impactful for people to kind of get inside the shoes of the families they're working with. So Lem Sisse, for instance, a poet, Black poet, care experienced adult, who's written incredibly movingly and speaks often into sort of social care and safeguarding settings about his experiences, is one person. There's Jenny, I think her name is Hackney Child, is her kind of handle on Twitter, somebody who's again written very movingly and speaks very movingly about her experiences as a child, and Safeguarding Survivor, who is her handle, who's called Annie, a woman who again speaks very movingly. And there are materials that we have on our site, and there are materials you can see and access on social media, on Twitter, as I say. But so that's one angle of kind of getting in alongside people. But really, you know, for every Annie or Hackney Child or Lem Sisse, there are local people who can tell their stories in that way. And, you know, developing and shaping and co-producing our service responses with the people that we've worked with or have experienced services locally is a huge way to both build people's empathy, build people's appetite, and sort of and hold us to task a little bit as well. I think it's Camden or Islington. Anyway, you know, it's quite hard, obviously, to engage the parents who've been involved in child protection, but it can be done. And if you can get, you know, there's often might be somebody, it might be the most feisty, it might be, you know, some of the most difficult people that you might have worked with, but to bring some of those people alongside to tell their story of their experience, warts and all, with working with professionals in Suffolk, starting groups, you know, where you're bringing people together to talk about their experiences. Those things can be, you know, I'm not saying they're not difficult, often difficult things to hear, but they are very motivating. We found when we, as I say, when we do conferences, 9 times out of 10, if we have that voice of experience there, which we try and always do, that's the bit that people say, you know, that really hit home to me. So I think that's something, as I say, you can access national stuff, but really thinking about how you draw those experienced people into your into shaping services where you are is a really important one as well.
Thank you, Susannah. That's a really excellent tip. And what I'm going to do is just ask Tracy, when you and I, Tracy, are planning our next meeting of the working group on neglect, let's make sure that we focus on this particularly and act on this advice. So I'm just going to come to some other questions from colleagues. So linked to what we've been talking about in relation to the complexity of neglect and the layers, the experience of parents in their earlier lives and the impact that has when they find themselves in a situation of perhaps deep poverty and the shame they experience or the lives that they're able to lead. A colleague is asking, is the term neglect too much of a fog? Do we need to think more specifically about key components and name them accordingly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a fair point. When you look at the prevalence statistics there in terms of, you know, the primary code on child in need and child protection, you do, don't you? You think, well, you know, how many different stories, how many different experiences are underneath the bonnet of that, and you know, it's part of the sort of problem of having a system. You know, any system, you know, creates tramlines, and in order to access services, often you have to you know, trigger those gateways, and therefore you're kind of tramlined into using particular terms, and this one being, you know, a huge kind of umbrella term for all of these different experiences. It's absolutely about getting under the skin of that and getting into the story of what's going on with that family. We often use that term story when we're talking in the materials that we have around doing analytical assessments. And when we were making those resources, which we made with practitioners, there was a lot of debate about the term story, because, you know, is that are you talking about a made up story? You know, is there something about veracity or truth about that? But it's the narrative of what's going on that, you know, human beings make sense through stories since we were sitting around, you know, campfires, since we first invented fire. You know, that's how we understand and get to the bottom of things, and understanding the story behind the presenting issues that you're seeing there is absolutely critical to being able to work through it. And the material that Danny Glazer wrote that I flagged there for us, and there's a whole lot of, there's one more slide with all the different covers on that you can help you to kind of navigate the materials on the Research in Practice website. or you can just put in the search term neglect and loads of this stuff will come up. The material that Dania wrote there, it really goes quite deeply into this approach, which is about tiers of concern, you know, thinking about, you know, what kind of level of things are we talking about? Are we talking about food poverty? That is that the primary issue here? Is it a strong parental relationship in all but the fact that they cannot afford, you know, X, Y, and Z? Or are we talking at this level? Are we talking about domestic abuse? You know, and those will require different kinds of responses. So it very much is about that, about thinking analytically, listening and hearing, recording clearly, not the reams and reams of narrative that can be part of hearing someone's story, but the key points in that story that help us to understand and help us to sort of share that understanding across a multi-agency partnership about, you know, what are our key responses that we need to make here.
Thank you. Now we're about a couple of minutes before 11 o'clock. I'm going to suggest we're going to run to 11:05, and then we're going to stop. So I'm going to squeeze in about 3 more questions here. Just before I do that, I must just come back to that term, which I think is absolutely central, understanding the story of neglect in the family. I couldn't agree more how important that is in relation to truly understanding what's going on. And I hear the concern that people might have about a word-like story in this context, but actually here we are working with human beings in their most vulnerable state and in their most disadvantaged of situations, however they've arrived at that. And so surely understanding it in terms of their story is absolutely central and critical. Let me ask you a couple of other questions from the audience then, Susannah. So one really important and particularly pertinent to Suffolk is about whether you have seen any important or current research about neglect in rural communities. And obviously this is an issue for us. We're a diverse county. Is there anything you would particularly point us at?
I can't think of any sort of specific research studies homing in on that. I mean, one of the kind of related things, I suppose, is the, you know, the question of neglect in affluent families. And we've talked a lot about poverty, and of course, you know, emotional abuse and neglect do occur in more affluent families as well. And, you know, and we need to be alert to that too. You know, presenting issues in rural situations can be very much around these issues of, you know, bus services, being able to get to contact centres, you know, being able to respond to the requirements of services, you know, from rural isolation, and the social isolation issue obviously is a very acute one often for people in living in rural situations. There's certainly been very interesting work around the sort of different responses that we have, or how the data shows us that where we're responding with a child safeguarding or child protection response in areas of high deprivation, the statistics look quite different than where we're responding in areas of affluence or low deprivation. I'm not going to try and get into the complexities of that now because it's quite difficult to explain, but there's again material on our site about it, and there's a very useful app that the University of Sheffield created for digging down into the sort of sub areas within your region and looking at the different kind of levels of affluence and poverty that are there. But, you know, it's fair to say that if you're in poverty in an affluent area, you know, you're going to be facing different issues in terms of a sense of exclusion and a sense of difference and a sense of not being able to access the things that most of the community around you are doing in terms of, you know, being able to jump in your car and go to a beauty spot or whatever. That's a bit different than if you're living in an area of Lowestoft, for instance, where you're surrounded by lots of people experiencing similar kinds of deprivation to that which you're experiencing in your own life.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question, and though just to reassure the audience, for all of the questions we have had a good number, and thank you everybody who's put up a question. That's really good, and we will seek to provide answers on the website along with the slides from this morning. So I'm going to conclude with one further question. Which comes back to a point which you made really strongly in the presentation, Susannah. It was about the impact of neglect at different stages in a child's life and in their childhood and as they enter early adulthood. And obviously, these current times, we're seeing, increasing concern about, for instance, a very difficult behaviour for small numbers of adolescents, and their sometimes antisocial behaviour in communities. What would you offer us? How would you summarise your current observation of the research around the impact, particularly in adolescence, but obviously for all life stages for children?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges there is that often adolescents are responded to in terms of their presenting behaviour without, again, the story being unpacked. So if you might be putting down conduct disorder, or repeatedly going missing or whatever, without necessarily unpacking what's going on underneath that. And that's really important, which again obviously takes building a relationship, because no adolescent is going to spill all their beans to you in the first 5 minutes of meeting up with you, but it is highly possible to do, again, given the space and time to create those relationships with young people. What may be very often going on there with a child going out, being out and exposed to risk and harm in the community, there may well be issues where there is what we would consider neglectful parenting going on. But again, we need to understand individual situations. So what we're seeing a lot from understanding about exploitation, criminal exploitation, county lines and all of that, is that sometimes we as professionals are really missing a trick in writing off the parents as neglectful, or not engaging with the parents as potential partners in the safeguarding relationship there, because in many cases those parents will be absolutely at the end of their tether, and really wanting to be part of the support, and and there's some quite harsh stories from parents about how they really feel that they have been stigmatized and sort of excluded from the safeguarding relationship, to the detriment of the situation that the young person finds themselves in. So it's tricky then, obviously, because a lot of water will have gone under the bridge by that time. But again, building your service responses to children, young people out in the community and exposed to exploitation and harm outside of the family home, it has to be done in tandem with the children and young people themselves. You have to build service responses that listen and hear them. There's really good work that's gone on in Greater Manchester over recent years in trying to build services in that way, and a lot of material available online about the approaches that went on there. There's this, the Contextual Safeguarding Network led by Carleen Furman, which is a fantastic sort of national network where they're really kind of helping us to think, well, we built this child protection system. The whole child protection system was built on the idea of harm happening within the home. We need to think differently about some of this stuff, because in many of these cases, it isn't necessarily about the parents' lack of parenting. It may be all sorts of other factors that is, driving or encouraging or seducing children out into situations of harm outside. There's a lot, again, I'm sort of piling on, there's a lot of material, but there's a lot of material on our site. My director, Des Holmes, is really passionate about the whole safeguarding adolescence agenda, and there's a lot of really good material on there that I'd encourage you to have a look at.
Susannah, thank you so much. I'm going to wrap us up at this stage now, to use a broadcasting term. I feel like I'm there now. So so the 3 or 4 points I'll just end by saying will be about you know, that point about the impact of neglect on all stages of childhood and all parts of a child's life, it really important and comes over so strongly in the presentation. A great deal there to say and understand about the impact of poverty, whether it's the immediate direct impact or the indirect and situational impact. Really critical, you know, again and again in our working lives, the importance of relationships, relationship building, understanding the relationships that you see in front of you as a practitioner. But the absolute thing for me that I'm going to take away as the headline is really having to understand the story of neglect and understand the lived experience of what's going on and how it came to be. So in conclusion, I'd just like to thank you very much indeed, Susannah, for your excellent presentation and thoughts and considerations this morning. That's been absolutely brilliant. And for everyone in the audience, thank you so much for joining us today and for your questions. For those questions that we've not had the opportunity to get to, we will endeavour to answer those, and the presentation and those answers will be put up on the Suffolk Safeguarding Partnership website shortly. So thank you very much, and at that point we'll close.
Thank you.
Thank you.